Welcome to
Hello,
TableTalk.
everybody.
And here on TableTalk, it's our privilege and joy to think about the Word of God, to think about biblical theology, to think about culture, and to encourage you in your walk with the Lord as we usually talk around the table. Today, we're not around the table. We're just going to sit in the chairs. It's a little more comfy, but always grateful for how the Lord is working. And as the Lord works, He provides us with all sorts of resources and ways to grow. His word is ever instructive in so many ways to teach us everything that we need for life and godliness. At first glance, it might not seem like the Bible has everything we need for life and godliness. It does not teach us about mathematics or science, but what it does teach us about is how to know God, how to love Him, how to be a student of His Word and His world. And when we gain those principles, as we listen to the Word of God, we are formed into His disciples who grow into His likeness. Luke, you wrote the e-bulletin this week. We're constantly trying to build off of our e-bulletins as we go towards Table Talk. And you were talking about the idea of teaching.
Yeah.
Why is this concept of teaching so important when we come to the book of Proverbs?
The book of Proverbs is, at its face, from the beginning, a book that is clearly designed to teach, even more specifically than I think, in some ways, all of Scripture is designed to teach. But the book of Proverbs in particular, from the very first verse we see are the words of a father to a son. They're clearly meant for the parent to pass along to his son things that he wants his son to know, ways that he wants his son to live. More than any other book, I think, there's this real sort of foundation of this is a book meant to teach that we as the readers are meant to learn from. It's all throughout. Not only do we see that the father teaches the son, but wisdom talks about, even wisdom personified is a teacher and calls people to heed her teaching. And there's all sorts of teaching throughout the book of Proverbs that really is kind of the foundational element of it. And so as we then think of the book of Proverbs, it's important for us to think about how do you teach, even how do you learn, and what in the book of Proverbs can we learn about how to teach and about how to learn, I think.
So let's build off of that idea in terms of how to teach and how to learn, because that will be incredibly helpful for us to think about. We know that we don't all learn the same way, which means that teaching has to be creative and unique, and it's designed specifically to do certain functions. So what would be some different ways that Proverbs, or not even Proverbs, but that we as human beings might grow in terms of learning?
There are, I think, many different theories about learning styles. You can sort of get many different categories. One that people know very well would be the idea of auditory learning versus visual learning versus learning by doing. Some people find that they can sit in a lecture hall and hear a teacher speak and have those words go into their ears, and they learn well from that. While other people find they can't do that at all and need to see it in a visual form, while other people find that actually getting into what's being talked about and doing what they're being taught, learning by doing, is the best way they learn. So this is one way we've all sort of been taught from an early age about how we can learn. I don't know if you can think of any other sorts of paradigms of learning styles that you've come across in your life.
You've highlighted one, I think, that's very typical, and it's a great model in terms of discipleship, which I talk about 4 stages. I do, you watch. I do, you help. You do, I help. You do, I watch.
Yeah.
And through that, there's the process of observation, practice, apprenticeship, and finally mastering a task. And so we definitely need to have that kind of skill. And certainly when we're thinking about life, we're not just conveying information, though, in the book of Proverbs, right?
Absolutely. Yes, the book of Proverbs, as we even talked about last week in particular when we talked about the fruit of wisdom, the book of Proverbs is all about not just having us know things in our heads, but actually having our lives changed, actually living in a way that God would have us live, walking on the good path and avoiding the path that leads to death. And so certainly, as we think about teaching and learning in the book of Proverbs, it isn't just about information. It's not just about what's in our brains. It's about how we take that and how that affects our lives and how that affects what we do with our actions on a day-to-day basis.
So when we think about that, Luke, we're aiming for more than just the transformation or the transference of knowledge.
Yeah.
We're looking for life transformation. What then are some ways that people may try to teach in order to bring about change?
Yeah, there are a variety of ways that Proverbs employs different teaching styles for the goal of imparting wisdom, for the goal of having the hearer live in a wise manner and in a wise way. And they sort of fall on a spectrum. We're reading a book that talks about this, and I think they had 9 or 10 different methods of teaching that range on a spectrum of sort of directive and authoritative on one side to really sort of indirect and unguided. And when you read the book of Proverbs, you see both of these things on full display. At certain points in the book of Proverbs, specifically when wisdom is talking, you see this a lot. The teacher is saying, this is why you should listen to me. This is why what I know is true and important, and you should listen to me. There's no invitation in that particular example for the learner to sort of participate. It is very much an authoritative pronouncement. We do have those in the book of Proverbs. And then on the other side, which is what I spent a lot of my time talking about in the e-bulletin, is Proverbs spends a lot of time with this sort of hands-off, indirect, sort of incentive-based approach where the teacher doesn't give any command at all, actually. The teacher will just say, this is what happens when you do this. This is what happens when you do this. If you, like a conditional statement, for example, if you do this, this will happen, and this will result, and that can either be good or bad. And in those types of situations, the teacher doesn't say, in many of these cases, you should do this. They don't present the conclusion. They lay out the conditions to the learner, to the one listening, and let them come up with their own choice. The goal there is really drilling in on that heart transformation. I don't know if this is the case for anybody watching. It's certainly the case for me, and I imagine you know people in your life who are far more likely to be willing to do something if they think it's their idea. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but there are people who their loved ones and their family know that if I ask them to do it, they may not, but if I can convince them that it was their idea to do it, then they'll do it. And Proverbs has a bit of an element of that, not, I think, with the goal of being subversive or manipulative, but recognizing that this is one really good way to get people to live in a certain way by letting them convince themselves of the goodness of one path and of the pain and the trial and difficulty of a bad path. We can see through things like this, and this ranges on a whole spectrum. Sometimes there's a command with no explanation. Sometimes there's a command with an explanation, which is a little less direct, a little less authoritative. The teacher might say, you should do this, and here's why. Sometimes, as we mentioned, they'll just say, I saw this happen, and this was something that I witnessed, and here's what happened, and you should now infer what you think you should do based on this information that I've given. Proverbs really does span the whole spectrum as it tries to seek this one goal of imparting wisdom to its reader, and I think that can be very instructional for us in the places in our lives where we are teachers, and also in places in our lives when we're learning.
So one of the things then that I think is helpful here is to recognize that there's also an age sensitivity when it comes to teaching. This week I was doing some more research into the structure of Proverbs, trying to understand it. It's very clear that Proverbs chapters 1 through 9, it's a unit because we have this "Hear my son." So there's this very clear sense of instruction. Is it we're not frozen, are we?
I think we can keep going.
Okay. So there's this clear, sorry, we're just looking at a tech element here today as we're recording. So there's this clear sense in chapters 1 through 9 that what is happening is that there is this son who is really youthful and needing to grow in wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So two commentators actually have worked fairly substantially on the structure of Proverbs, and Ray Van Leeuwen and Chris Ansberry, they've written their works on the structure of Proverbs, and they've said that really chapters 1 through 9 start with a young person. Chapters 10 through 15 is that young person entering into the world. Chapters 15 through 21 is this young person then moving into a position of being working out justice in the magistrates, then in the courts in chapters 22 through 24, as an advisor to the king in chapters 25 through 27, as the king in waiting in chapters 28 and 29, and then as the king himself. And so there's this progression, and they note that it starts off with very simple, basic, clear sayings. In fact, I had someone say to me, Proverbs 1 through 9, it seems like we're repeating a lot of the same things, which isn't that what you do with a child? You're instructing them over and over in basic black and white type of structures. Mm-hmm. But as they get older, then you're having to add the nuances. So I don't tell my 2-year-old all the nuances about when it's safe to touch something hot and when it's not to. I just tell them don't touch. Yeah. But as they grow, I am enabling them to understand the nuances of when you can touch something that might be hot and when it might not be, because they have the faculties to discern, they have the wisdom to know. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, Proverbs then has this growing complexity from simple to complex in terms of wisdom. And I think that's instructive as well, because you've got a young boy at home.
Yes.
And so when you're thinking about training him in wisdom, what's that looking like for you?
Yeah, parenting is one of the places where even if even if you'll never be a teacher, if you'll not be a professor or a preacher, or if teaching will never be a part of your life in any other way, for most people at some point in their lives, they'll have children or even nieces and nephews. There'll be elements to teach as an authoritative figure in a child's life for many, many people. And very much what we're talking about here in the book of Proverbs is super, super instructive for that. As we think specifically about age sensitivity and faculties, there's very little that you would want to do with a toddler in terms of laying out the options and having them consider the nuances of cause and effect and consequences. When my son, this has happened somewhat recently, when my son gets a little too close to the road, I'm going to tell him to stop based on my authority as a parent, and that's it. There's no discussion, there's no argument, there's no attempt to reason even. It's just very clearly, this is what I'm saying, and you need to listen. And Proverbs, it does have some of that, but then I think also, as we think of parenting, maybe on the other side, it can be the case that some parents may be tempted to hold on to that approach for too long. Yeah. And as their children get older, as their children become more independent, as they're able to reason more, some parents will maybe be in a place where they're tempting their children to sort of be driven away by maintaining this same sort of incredibly rigid, disciplined structure. There's no explanation, there's no reasoning, there's none of that. There can always be a place for that, but as children get older, the teaching role changes very much. And I think to realize that there is a breadth of what teaching and what faithful teaching looks like in any context, but specifically in the context of parenting, is really helpful and really instructive.
Yeah, and so we could talk then a little bit about moral reasoning in terms of teaching. Mm-hmm. That when we start with just thinking in terms of teaching in terms of age appropriate levels. When we're teaching someone who's young, we teach them the black and white categories.
Yeah.
This is what Proverbs 1 through 9 does. It talks about this is the one path, this is the other path. There are two paths. Go on this path. Don't even put your foot on that path.
Mm-hmm.
But as we get into those years where our children are developing more independence, they're becoming teenagers, they need the moral reasoning. They don't just need the black and white understanding of this is right, this is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They need the why. And then as we get older, we need to understand more of the complexities of that why, that we don't stop learning that there are greater nuances to how we apply things, which is why you don't see such contradictory statements at the beginning of Proverbs like you do in chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. Answer a fool according to his folly, and you will become like him. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you become like him in his own eyes. And so it looks like there's a contradictory statement, but actually, by the time you get to Proverbs 26, there's this deep moral reasoning that's being implanted that you can discern the difference as to when you should answer a fool and when you shouldn't answer a fool. And that's part of the complexities of wisdom, that wisdom requires, its application requires wisdom in and of itself.
Yes, absolutely. And in that way, I've argued in the e-bulletin that Proverbs doesn't just teach wisdom, but it itself is a wise teacher.
Yes.
That we can learn from even in how to teach, whether you are a parent or a grandparent and involved in teaching children, or whether you teach in any variety of contexts. We can look not only to what the book of Proverbs is teaching us, but also we can think about how the book of Proverbs is teaching us. And that's something that I would encourage all of us to do as we continue to go through the book of Proverbs, is to pay attention to that, because even as we're talking here, it's very obvious that Proverbs is very intentional in the way that it teaches and the way that it conveys what it wants to convey, not just in the message, in the content of what it's saying.
And to that end, I would say, just to speak to the structure of Proverbs, I have often read the book of Proverbs and thought chapters 1 through 9 are very straightforward and simple, but the rest of the book seems to be this random smattering of sayings and expressions. And yet the reality is that as I've spent time, as I've been trying to study, and as I've listened to people who have spent more time in Proverbs than me, I'm discovering that there's far more depth and complexity to this book than I initially even understood. That even as I'm beginning chapter 4 verse 10 through 19, I'm still looking ahead and discovering there's so much more that I have to learn. And if that's the case, as we look at the Word of God, and that we have so much more to learn and to grow and to understand so that we might apply skillfully the wisdom that God has for us, then how much more is that true for all of life? So Luke, any final encouragements as we're trying to encourage people in terms of their teaching today? What would you say to someone who is wanting to grow in that ability to influence others through teaching?
Yeah, I would say, just launching off of this conversation, just have the concept in your mind of there are various ways to teach, and there are various methods of teaching that can be helpful based on who you're teaching and based on what your goals are. I think this is a thing that is maybe just not something often at the forefront of your mind, and this is one of those things where even just having the concept and even having the awareness that maybe different teaching methods and styles are more suited to one situation or the other, I think will go a long way. Pay attention not only to what you're trying to teach, but who you're talking to and how you're conveying that information. And as you think in those ways, I imagine that will go a very long way to helping teachers of all sorts grow in effectiveness.
And to that, I would also add, consider how there are different forms of instruction. Some is by giving clear directives that these are the consequences, and other times natural consequences are sufficient teachers in and of themselves. And so I don't have to discipline a child When they have touched something hot and burnt themselves, I don't have to discipline them. The discipline was in the natural consequence.
Mm-hmm.
But as they get older, we have to talk about how the consequences, they need to be thought out beforehand. If you're teaching a child to drive, for example, long before you get behind the wheel, you want them to understand the consequences of choices. You're helping them to grow in skill. And in the same way, that's how the Lord teaches us. He is slow to anger. He is abounding in steadfast love. He is a God of patience. He is a God who works in our lives over an entire lifetime to sanctify us so that we would be like his Son. So as you think about influencing others and teaching others, consider the book of Proverbs. Look at its structure. Think about the many various ways that it teaches, from natural consequences to clear commands that are directive to implied suggestions, and consider how you might use those things in Proverbs in your own life for the effectiveness of influencing others. Thanks for joining us on Table Talk. As always, we worship Sunday mornings, 10:30 at CBC, 10 o'clock actually, 10 a.m. CBC Ilderton. And you can always find more information on our website, cbcilderton.ca. And we're always glad to serve you. If you've got a question, drop us an email under the staff page. You can connect with Luke or myself. And we're always grateful for what God is doing. And if this video has been an encouragement to you, please let us know. And if you've got ideas for future Table Talks, we'd love to hear from you.
Mm-hmm.
Until next week, God bless you. And we look forward to seeing you in worship. God bless. Have a great week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.